We have a few props again this morning. Yay. No handouts. Photocopier broke down. So, we're stuck with just watching me. Okay, but we got the props. Yay. The other one.
You had one more. Where is it?
Another prop?
This is not.
Oh, yes. We'll use that too. Luke 16a. Yes, I'm breaking this chapter down into two sections because there's a lot to cover. I'm going to separate it because there's two very diverse themes in chapter 16, and I think we're going to be busy trying to cover this one theme of the shrewd dude. A lot of people have tried to explain this one. I've never really been satisfied with their explanations, so I did a bunch of digging, and so you're in for a unique interpretation on this shrewd dude. Okay? All right. I'm going to turn this parable right side up, hopefully. Now remember, our modern commentator, Liefeld is his name. He says the interpretation of the parable of the shrewd manager is notoriously difficult. And I'm not satisfied with his interpretation of it. You're going to hear something radically different. Not only because his interpretation endorses pride, laziness, and fraudulent works, it endorses making friends and influencing people at all costs, but also because his interpretation doesn't resonate well with the parable of the 10 minas that we will be studying in Luke 19. Nor am I satisfied with Calvin's ancient interpretation. My beloved Calvin, imagine that. Calvin, who constantly makes apologies for his interpretation of this parable. And he twice reminds us that to inquire with great exactness into every minute part of the parable is an absurd mode of philosophizing, which is what I suggested last study anyways. So, I'm going to suggest a rather novel interpretation for you, an interpretation which should make this parable considerably less difficult for you to understand, an interpretation which hockey fans should find much less difficult. Okay, on with the hockey garb, right? Okay. Trying to make it memorable for you, okay? Here we go. Hockey jersey.
Hockey jersey.
Number?
Mario Lemieux.
Mario! Okay, here we go. Except Mario. This is going to be about Gordie Howe. Mr. Hockey, the legend. A legend who is tough to forget.
I look good.
Oh! But in order to accept my interpretation, you have to accept that sometimes Gentleman Jesus is mocking people. Yes, mocking people. Just as he was mocking those Pharisees and teachers of the law that we spoke of just before this notorious parable, if you recall. He was mocking them as he compared them to the unrejoicing son. You are always with me, Jesus said, and everything I have is yours. As if that wasn't hyperbole and a half. When we see that he gave the repentant son the best robe, the ring, the sandals, and the calf. Well, the unrepentant son, he never even got a goat, did he? And yes, those Pharisees and teachers of the law are his punching bag once again. Punching bag. All right. Punching. Repentance.
Careful.
Remember that one. Despite this parable seemingly being told to his disciples, we see in verse 1, seemingly, we see that the Pharisees were overhearing all of this. They were at his backside all this time. They were sneering at Jesus all the while, since they knew that this parable was a backhand shot at them. We saw that. You can read that in verse 14. They knew it was directed to them, even if he might have been talking to the disciples. He knew he was talking. They knew they were talking to. And that backhand shot is completely validated by Jesus saying, "You are the ones who justify yourselves." As if that justification is even possible. That is not even hyperbole. So, this account only seems out of order. Oh,
The count.
oh, go count, go! Oh, owie, now. It only seems out of order, but is only out of order if it is not a backhand shot. And Luke most certainly knew it was a backhand. From our previous analysis, Luke was probably there, so it didn't sound all that notorious to him. And don't think that backhand shots are the least bit unethical either. In my training as a table tennis coach, I was taught that you score most points with your backhand. 75% of your shots are with your backhand. Yes. Nothing wrong with backhands. And in hockey, goals scored by backhands, they outnumber goals scored by wraparounds, wrists, or even slap shots. Yes, backhands are good. With that in mind, let's take a look at who the master, kurios, of this parable actually is. Verse 8. Who's the master here? Now, those narrow Pharisees may be thinking that the master is the Lord God himself. Well, and even our commentator Liefeld says, well, maybe Jesus, they think maybe Jesus is referring to himself here. Well, no, it's not what I believe. That would not make any sense to the Pharisees. Yet we know from previous discussion in Acts and various other contexts that Luke is very ambiguous with the word Lord and God, and that this word Lord may be merely the master of the house, as we saw in chapter 13. Or this master of the Pharisees may even be the devil himself, as you might read in John 8:44. But let's be super conservative about this. And let's just grant the lord it over him phrase that is used by Matthew, Mark, and Paul in this case. And in this case, that would be money lording over those Pharisees. Money, yeah, we knew that. And we see that from verse 13, where the contrast is given between God and money. And then, continuing on with that backwards perspective, let's see who this commendation, this endorsement might be coming from. Let's see who this endorsement of shrewdness is coming from. Well, it certainly doesn't appear to be coming from my Lord and God. More likely it is coming from their Lord and God. A lord of those who gain friends for themselves with money. A lord who welcomes unrighteous dudes, verse 8, with money. Welcomes them to some ambiguous eternal dwelling because of their fraud in verse 9. Yet Calvin tries to find this behavior of the shrewd dude commendable. Hardly. Even if it is dishonest behavior, Calvin tries to pawn this off as, well, just good stewardship. Hardly. Even if it is stewardship to an idol, an idolatry of fickle friendship, rather than properly pawning this off as a backhand slap in the face by Jesus. So this dude's behavior is supposed to be trustworthy? As we see in verses 10, 11, and 12? Hardly. I think not. It's about as trustworthy as a fox guarding a henhouse. But enough of that backhand parable. Now Jesus turns around to face those Pharisees dead on. Dead on. Not playing games with them anymore. He faces them dead on. This is where Jesus shows them a Gordie Howe hat trick. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Gordie Howe hat trick. Anybody know what a Gordie Howe hat trick is? Nope. Gordie Howe hat trick, according to his son, and probably everybody, his son, Mark Howe, says a Gordie Howe hat trick is a cross check, an assist, and a goal. That's a Gordie Howe hat trick. Now, we're going to explain that in those terms. What's happening? To the first dude, Pharisees lined up behind him. First dude, he says. First dude, he gives a cross check to the face. Yes! Right to the face. That's what Gordy did. And his son knows as much too. His son says as much. Cross-check serious enough to leave some stitches, suggesting that everyone is forcing their way into the kingdom. Huh? Not. Did you hear the sermon this morning? Doesn't happen. Nobody seeks after God. No one. You've studied Romans. You know better than that. Now you know it from Psalm 14. No one. Not even close. Now, to the next dude. May have been a scribe. This is what he says. He assists this next dude in doing his job properly. Roughly, generally telling that scribe to do a lot better job of editing his sloppy manuscripts. To dot his I's and cross his T's. Then, to the next dude. Gets a little more vicious. A little more vicious than a cross-check to the face. The next dude, he roughly fires a crotch shot. Bang! Yeah, worse than America's Funniest Videos. Calling the dude who divorced his wife for reasons other than adultery an adulterer. Imagine that. Jesus, right out, calling him an adulterer. Now we're going to study that a little more in Corinthians next year. That's going to be exciting. So this was a big ouch in Jewish culture. Adultery. You get killed for that. That's capital punishment. So it's a big deal in Jewish culture. Next dude. What happens to the next dude? The next dude, who married a deservedly divorced woman, he calls an adulterer, calling him a disgrace to the chosen race of Israel for patronizing her sin, telling that liberal that he will he will share the consequences right along with her. How's that for a backhand goal, Fizzer? Nasty Jesus. Not a good way for Jesus to make friends and influence people, huh? What was he thinking? Not too shrewd of a mood, dude. Those are the people you want to influence. Those are the movers and shakers. But that's just the way that Jesus moves, isn't it? And so should you if you want to score goals like Mr. Hockey. If you want to join Jesus on the podium. Or would you rather join that other Lord on the podium? What other Lord, huh? Would you rather make friends and influence people with money? Yeah, well then, you and the Herod and the fox are going to have a whole lot of fun together. Okay. That's my wild interpretation.